homeless, where all the critical infrastructure would be destroyed, where you would have no communications, no transportation, the inability to get goods and services to people. And so we identified 5 scenarios that we wanted to deal with. The first one was a Category 3, 4, or 5 hurricane hitting New Orleans. Why is that important? Because anybody who's ever been involved in emergency management knows that New Orleans sits below sea level, that the levees probably cannot withstand even a Category 2 hurricane, and that they're susceptible to flooding all the time, even with that hurricane. So that was the number 1 scenario we wanted to plan for. And just to inform the audience, Scott, the others were the big one hitting California, which we've all heard about, if something happens to the San Andreas Fault. The third one was the New Madrid Fault. Many of you may not have even heard of that, but a fault like the San Andreas Fault, which runs through the eastern United States, could take out cities like Louisville and Cleveland and Columbus as badly as the big one would in California. The fourth scenario was a Category 5 hurricane. Imagine this. A Hurricane Katrina, instead of going into the Gulf of Mexico, instead goes up the East Coast and goes through Midtown Manhattan or Boston. And the fifth scenario we wanted to plan for was a tsunami off the Oregon and Washington coast. Scientists and geologists will tell us that we're near the end of a 3,000-year period where those plates may shift and there's the likelihood of a tsunami off those coasts. So those were the 5 scenarios that we wanted to plan for. Never been done before. Congress, or the administration, first gave me money. I'd asked for $80 million to do all 5 of those plans. That money was then taken away, and we were left with just the first tabletop exercise for the hurricane striking New Orleans, called Hurricane Pam. That report came out in July of 2005, 6 weeks before Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans. And in that report, it identified all of the problems that, one, we knew we were going to have, and all the things that need to be done to fix it. And it was clearly going to take us at least 2 years because of the way the budgets work in Washington, the need to change the policies and the regulations and how you have to go through and change those things in statutes. It would take us at least 2 years to even start down the path of doing the planning and the changes that Hurricane Pam showed us. And to show you how out of touch Washington, D.C. is with the potential for catastrophic disasters hitting this country. During my Senate hearings post-Katrina, I was asked by a United States Senator from Maine, and she asked me this question. She said, Mr. Brown, you got the Hurricane Pam report in mid-July of 2005. Why didn't you make those changes before Hurricane Katrina struck? I wanted to choke her. She's a United States Senator. She understands the budget process. She understands the regulatory process and what it would take to implement those changes. So, Scott, in answer to your question, I think the administration was so focused on terrorism, was so focused on other issues, that the Department of Homeland Security was just kind of it was a problem child. They didn't want to deal with it. I talked to the president directly about catastrophic incidents and what we needed to do to get ready, and he had turned a deaf ear. And one of my big mistakes, I've admitted to many mistakes, one of my big mistakes was once he turned that deaf ear, I should have left the administration and gone public.
Now, there were a lot of changes going on within FEMA at that time. A lot of turmoil.
It was. I don't know how many of you have been in business where there's been a merger and acquisition, but there's always a clash of cultures, there's a clash of budgets, all of those things going on. And when the Department of Homeland Security was created, the president actually asked me to be on the transition team to move FEMA into DHS. So my goal was, and I think the goal at the time of the administration was to make FEMA the cornerstone of DHS, but that's not how it turned out. Let me tell you a couple of reasons why. To give you some perspective, because I think perspective is important, DHS has 187,000 employees. Its budget is $42 billion last I checked. FEMA has 800 people at headquarters. We can ramp up to about 3,000 people, maybe 12,000 if we really push it. Our operating budget is $800 million, not even $1 billion. So you can see that we're the little cog in that giant wheel. So what happened is, as you start creating this new department, the bureaucracies begin to take over and they begin to grow. And the next thing you know, I call them DHS taxes. Remember those fights we used to have? DHS would come to us and say, we're going to create a centralized human resources system. And FEMA, we need $80 million or $50 million or $40 million from you. That's 10% of my budget. And so suddenly, at the very beginning of DHS, they were beginning to emasculate FEMA. So in March of 2003, I crafted a memo, sent it to then Secretary Tom Ridge. And the conclusion of the memo was this: if you continue down this path of taxing FEMA, taking away its programs, and doing other things we need to talk about, preparedness, all those issues, but if you continue to do those things, this President Bush will face the same thing that President Bush 41 faced in Hurricane Andrew, and that is a FEMA that will fail and not be able to perform its job. And Secretary Ridge turned a deaf ear to my protests about what was happening. I reiterated those protests to Chertoff when he became secretary, and again turned a deaf ear. But I think it's important for the audience to understand what those changes were and the impacts they have. You know, if you're a football coach, Little League, NFL, doesn't make any difference. What do? You practice over and over and over with your defense, with your offense. You play with that team that you have, because that's the team that's going to go out on the field and face the opponent. And that's why in emergency management you have these 4 cycles of preparing for a disaster, responding to disaster, recovering, and then mitigating from a disaster. And preparedness is the inherent, integral part of being a success when it comes time to respond. Well, what DHS was doing was they were splitting preparedness out of FEMA. So the preparedness was going to go over here to another part of the department where they were going to focus on law enforcement, which has very little to do with FEMA. And so even though they would say you've got to fight as you train and train as you fight, they in practice were doing just the opposite. So that when FEMA would show up at a disaster, we would be meeting those people we're responding with for the first time. They were breaking the cycle of emergency management. And the same was true with response. They were taking money out of response and using it for intelligence activities and other things. They took away the recovery money. At the time that Katrina occurred, we were down in terms of the full-time employees we had. I was about 25%, or so, give or take a certain percent, short of employees. I was bare bones. FEMA was basically crippled at that point because of budget cuts, money being taken out, programs being split apart. And that's what I was trying to warn the administration about. And that's how they were breaking that cycle. Because if you don't tie those 4 things together, preparing, responding, recovering, and mitigating, if you break any one of those things, the whole thing falls apart. What DHS was doing was breaking every single one of them.
Should FEMA be a part of the DHS?
No.
And second part of that question, if FEMA were not part of DHS, would Katrina still have happened?
FEMA should not be a part of DHS if it's going to continue down the path it's continuing to go down, because you have a clash of cultures. Remember, think about what the function is of Homeland Security. DHS is to prevent things from happening. That's why you have TSA at the airports. You know, TSA is to make sure I don't take on shampoo, which is obviously a national security threat if I don't disclose my shampoo. That's why DHS has Customs and Border Patrol, because clearly we don't want bad people to cross our borders illegally. We don't want people to cross our borders illegally. You get my point? DHS can't even fulfill its mission well now, yet they want to fold in the FEMA mission of responding to things. You see, we're the cleanup guys, so that if somebody bad gets through, like happened on September 11th, FEMA responds, and we come in and we help state and local governments. It's exactly what we did on September 11th. It's exactly what we did on 160 other disasters that I oversaw prior to Katrina. But I think your most important question is, if FEMA had not been a part of DHS when Katrina struck, would the result have been the same? I think it would have been only marginally better. It would have been only marginally better, and here's why. Because at the end of the day, it's still the primary responsibility of state and local governments to respond to disasters. And all FEMA does is come in and assist by coordinating. If somebody says they need X, FEMA tries to find X and get it to them. So if you have a dysfunctional system to begin with at the state and local level, FEMA is going to be marginalized at the beginning anyway. So I think it would have been better, but maybe not by much.
Knowing what we knew from Hurricane Pam in that tabletop exercise, knowing, or at least feeling.
Can we stop one second? Does everybody understand what a tabletop exercise is? The tabletop exercise is where you sit in a room, literally at a tabletop, and you have all the different people that might be involved in an incident. You know, firefighters and medical people and law enforcement. You have all of those together, and you have a scenario. The scenario is a hurricane coming into New Orleans. And you go through the procedures that you would exercise, and you figure out, based on just that tabletop, talking about it, what doesn't work. That's a tabletop exercise.
And that is with the states, the local government.